take a second and just picture your nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
You are probably imagining this, giant, continuous, tangled web of wires running all the way from the top of your head down to your toes. And you probably assume they're all basically doing the exact same thing.
Right, like one big electrical grid.
Exactly. But today, our mission is to completely dismantle that image. We are going to reveal the brilliant and honestly life and death division of labor that is happening inside your body right at this very second.
It really forces a completely different way to look at human biology.
Yeah.
We are pulling from a really fascinating collection of anatomy and physiology texts today, and they all center on this one massive conceptual split.
The big one.
The two great divisions of your nervous system. You've got the central nervous system, or the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to be clear. This is not just some dry anatomy lesson where we memorize a boring list of body parts.
Oh, definitely not.
No, we are looking at centuries-old scientific rivalries, organs that have literally been misclassified for decades, and viruses that act like biological hackers to just hijack your internal wiring.
It's wild stuff.
It is. So at the most basic level, your nervous system has two main jobs, right? It gathers information from your body and the outside world, and then it produces a coordinated response. And the CNS and the PNS just kind of split those responsibilities down the middle.
Yeah, and the best way to really understand that split is to look at the extreme lengths the body goes to protect one half of it. So the central nervous system is the integrator.
Right.
It consists of your brain, which is packing, roughly 86 billion neurons, and your spinal cord. That is where the decisions are made, where your memories are stored, where all your voluntary commands originate.
The important stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because it holds all that critical, totally irreplaceable data, it is guarded like a medieval fortress.
Yeah, going through the sources, it's crazy to see just how intense that physical armor actually is. The CNS is entirely encased in solid bone.
Right, the skull and the vertebral column.
Right, but then inside that bone, the brain and spinal cord are also wrapped in these three distinct protective membranes. The texts call them the meninges. So there's the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And they don't just sit there passively.
No, they have very specific jobs. They act as this whole multi-layered defense system. So the outermost layer is the dura mater, which actually translates to tough mother in Latin, which I always loved.
A great name.
It is. And it's this thick, leather-like shell. Then right beneath that, you have the arachnoid mater, which, as it sounds, kind of looks like a spider web. It acts as a physical shock absorber.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And finally, the pia mater is this incredibly delicate membrane that clings tightly to every single fold of the brain tissue itself. And on top of that bony armor and those three membranes, the entire system is just floating in a pressurized bath of cerebrospinal fluid.
Just to cushion it against any sudden impacts. So as I was reading through this, a specific analogy just kept coming to mind. It's like the central nervous system operates exactly like a highly classified, heavily fortified server room in like a corporate headquarters.
Like that.
Right. It's behind locked doors. It's guarded by security, climate control, the whole deal. Meanwhile, the peripheral nervous system is the vast network of vulnerable, completely exposed fiber optic cables running out to all the remote branch offices.
That analogy holds up perfectly, actually, especially when you look at the anatomy of the PNS. The peripheral system is just the wiring and the sensors.
Right.
It includes the 12 pairs of cranial nerves emerging from the brain, the 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and the ganglia.
And the ganglia those are just clusters of neuron cell bodies, right?
Yeah, basically clusters sitting just outside that central fortress. And this vast web reaches into everything, your skin, your muscles, your internal organs.
And unlike that secure server room, these biological cables are just totally exposed to the elements. I mean, they run right through your joints. They're scraping against muscle. They have to deal with mechanical stress, toxins, random pathogens every single day.
Yeah, they take a beating.
They really do.
Yeah.
And their entire job is to just carry sensory signals inward, which are afferent signals, and then carry the motor commands outward, the efferent signals.
Well, returning to your server room analogy, physical armor just isn't enough to protect the central integrator from what those exposed cables encounter out in the wild.
Right, because things could travel up the cables.
Exactly. So the CNS relies on what is essentially the ultimate biological firewall, which is the blood-brain barrier.
Oh, yeah, the BBB. I was reading about how this barrier was first discovered, and the early experiments are just visually stunning to think about.
They really are.
In 1885, there was this scientist named Paul Ehrlich, and he tried to literally dye an animal from the inside out.
Yeah, he injected this incredibly potent dye called trypan blue directly into an animal's bloodstream. And when he examined the tissue later, the dye had stained pretty much every single organ in the body a bright, vivid blue.
Just blue everywhere.
Everywhere. The liver, the heart, the lungs. But the brain and the spinal cord were completely pristine. They hadn't absorbed a single drop of the color.
Which is crazy because the blood pumps absolutely everywhere in the body, yet something physically stopped the dye from crossing into the central nervous tissue.
Right. And then a few decades later, his student, Edwin Goldman, performed the exact reverse of that experiment.
Right. He flipped it.
Yeah, he injected that exact same blue dye directly into the cerebrospinal fluid, so he completely bypassed the bloodstream.
Oh.
And the result totally flipped.
Oh, wow.
Only the brain and spinal cord turned blue, while the rest of the body stayed perfectly clean.
So the server room really is chemically sealed off from the rest of the building.
Completely. And the mechanism behind that seal is incredibly elegant. So out in the rest of your body, the cells lining your blood vessels, the endothelial cells, they have these tiny little gaps between them.
To let nutrients in.
Exactly. Nutrients, immune cells, they slip right into your tissues. But in the central nervous system, those endothelial cells are basically fused together by what we call tight junctions.
Like a brick wall?
Yeah, think of it like bricks in a wall held together by this totally impermeable mortar. It ensures the integrator isn't accidentally compromised by, say, fluctuations in your blood chemistry or by bloodborne pathogens that the peripheral cables fight off on a routine basis.
Okay, so we have this fortified server room, and we have these exposed cables running everywhere else. But to really grasp how they communicate with each other, we have to look at the history of how humans mapped this invisible traffic flow. Because for an astonishingly long time, the smartest minds in medicine just had this entirely wrong.
Oh, completely backward. For about 1,400 years, the dominant medical paradigm was based on a massive misconception by the Greek physician Galen.
This was in the 2nd century CE, right?
Right.
Because human dissection was a huge cultural taboo in ancient Rome, so Galen was doing all his anatomical research by dissecting, like, Barbary macaques, pigs, and sheep.
Yeah, making a lot of assumptions.
To his credit, I guess, he correctly identified that nerves physically ran outward from the brain and spinal cord. But his explanation of how the signals actually traveled is just wild.
It's so funny in retrospect. Galen concluded that nerves were literal physical hollow tubes.
Like pipes.
Yeah. He believed they functioned like plumbing. He thought they pumped this mysterious, invisible substance called psychic pneuma, or animal spirits, down to the muscles, basically inflating them into moving.
Wait, so for over a millennium, physicians who were out there treating severe injuries honestly believed human nerves were hollow pipes filled with magical spirit air.
That was the absolutely undisputed scientific consensus.
Yeah.
I mean, Galen's framework was completely riddled with errors because he was constantly just extrapolating from animal anatomy to humans.
Right.
It wasn't actually until 1543 that a Flemish anatomist named Andreas Vesalius corrected the record.
Vesalius, right. He defied the stigma and did actual human dissections.
Exactly. He performed his own meticulous human dissections, and he published this monumental text called Humani Corporis Fabrica. His precise illustrations finally gave the structural split between the CNS and PNS some real empirical footing.
But mapping the structural roads is totally different from understanding which direction the traffic is actually allowed to travel on those roads.
What's fascinating here is that the functional proof of how signals travel in and out emerged from this intense and honestly somewhat petty scientific rivalry in the early 19th century.
Ah, the discovery of the one-way streets.
Yes. So in 1811, you have this Scottish anatomist named Charles Bell. He discovers that if you sever the anterior or the ventral roots of the spinal nerves, so the cable is plugging into the front of the spinal cord, the subject lost the ability to move, but they could still feel physical sensation perfectly fine.
Okay.
Then, a decade later, a French physiologist named François Magendie demonstrates the exact opposite. If you sever the posterior or dorsal roots, it destroys sensation completely, but it leaves voluntary movement totally unaffected.
Boom. They proved functional directionality, and together this became known as the Bell-Magendie law, right?
Exactly. Motor signals only travel out through the ventral roots. Sensory signals only travel in through the dorsal roots.
That breakthrough is huge because it made the entire architecture of how the CNS and PNS communicate scientifically legible. Like, it laid the foundation for the whole concept of the reflex arc.
Yeah, the early anatomical map was finally codified. You've got the fortress, the cables, the specific in-routes, and the out-routes. It sounds like a perfectly tidy system.
Right, but here's where it gets really interesting, because biology just hates perfectly tidy systems.
It really does.
When you look closely at these boundaries today, you find these incredibly ragged edges that just blur the lines between what is a central server and what is just an exposed cable. And I think the most famous example is sitting right behind your eyes.
Oh, the optic nerve.
Right. It is literally called a nerve, which obviously implies it belongs to the peripheral nervous system.
Structurally and embryologically, though, the optic nerve is actually a direct physical outgrowth of the brain itself.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it is pure central nervous system tissue. The protective coating around it, the myelin, is built by these CNS-specific cells called oligodendrocytes. True peripheral nerves use a totally different type of cellular insulation called Schwann cells.
So anatomists only call it a nerve for historical reasons.
Basically, yes.
But functionally, it behaves exactly like brain tissue. And this completely changes how we understand certain diseases, right? Like multiple sclerosis. MS is an autoimmune condition that specifically targets the central nervous system, yet it very frequently attacks the optic nerve.
Exactly. If the optic nerve were a true peripheral cable, MS wouldn't even recognize it or attack it. But because it is essentially just a piece of the brain extending outward to, cup the back of the eyeball, it falls victim to a CNS-specific pathology.
Wow. And the boundary gets even blurrier when we look all the way down at the gut. The enteric nervous system is this mesh of roughly 500 million neurons lining the walls of your digestive tract. And traditionally, this was just lumped in as a minor subdivision of the peripheral wiring.
Right, until 1998, when this physiologist Michael Gershon published a book formally dubbing it the second brain.
Which is a crazy title. Does this mean the central nervous system isn't always the undisputed boss? Like, is my gut literally making its own independent physiological decisions without my brain's permission?
It absolutely is. The enteric nervous system can generate really complex local reflexes entirely on its own.
Wow.
A great example is peristalsis, those synchronized wave-like muscle contractions that force food down your digestive tract. That complex mechanical process can continue functioning perfectly even if you completely sever the vagus nerve.
And the vagus nerve is the primary communication cable connecting the gut to the brain, right?
Right.
So the main server room has been completely disconnected, but the remote branch office just keeps running its own local software anyway.
That's a great way to put it. Modern neuroscience views this less as a hard, impenetrable border and more as this functional continuum. The CNS is the primary integrating hub, sure, but the PNS acts as a highly distributed network that frequently runs its own localized programs without even asking for central authorization.
So as much as we talk about blurs and continuums, these physical classifications are not just academic trivia. I mean, whether a bundle of neurons is classified as CNS or PNS physically dictates whether you recover from catastrophic injuries.
Yeah, this brings us to the great regeneration divide. It is honestly one of the most consequential and counterintuitive biological mechanisms in the human body.
And it all comes down to those protective coatings we mentioned earlier, right? The myelin insulation around the biological wires, the specific cells constructing that myelin dictate your entire ability to heal.
Precisely. So in the peripheral nervous system, your exposed cables, that insulation is manufactured by Schwann cells. When a peripheral nerve is violently injured, say you, crush a nerve in your forearm, those Schwann cells immediately go to work. They actively clear out all the dead cellular debris.
The sources refer to this cleanup process as Wallerian degeneration.
Yeah, named after Augustus Waller, who originally documented the phenomenon by observing severed frog nerves under a microscope back in 1850.
Oh, wow.
So once the Schwann cells clear the wreckage, they actually form a physical regeneration tube. They excrete chemical growth factors that guide the severed nerve fiber, the axon, to regrow across the gap and reconnect directly to the target muscle.
And it regrows at a pretty staggering rate, right? Something like roughly 1 millimeter per day.
Exactly. Over the course of months, you can restore full sensation and movement to a crushed arm.
Okay, so the vulnerable cables have their own built-in hazardous materials crew and construction team, but the heavily guarded server room doesn't have this capability at all.
No. Central nervous system axons essentially do not regenerate.
Yeah.
And it is not just that brain and spinal cord tissue is incredibly fragile. It is that the cells making the myelin in the CNS, the oligodendrocytes, actively halt the healing process.
See, I have to push back on this. If the peripheral system evolved this miraculous cleanup crew to fix broken wires, why on earth would the brain actively barricade its own healing process? I mean, the sources mention specific molecules called no-go proteins, along with dense glial scars that chemically and physically block any attempt at regrowth. Why evolve a central nervous system that actively refuses to heal itself?
It seems backwards, right? But if we connect this to the bigger picture, you are looking at a brutal evolutionary trade-off. The central nervous system is infinitely complex. It physically encodes your memories, your learned motor behaviors, your deeply ingrained personality traits, all within highly specific, incredibly fragile synaptic connections.
Right.
If the neurons in your brain or spinal cord were constantly rewiring themselves and growing new connections every time you experienced minor inflammation or a mild concussion, you could instantly lose those complex, stable circuits. You would literally lose who you are.
Oh man. So it prioritizes the absolute architectural stability of the system over the flexibility of regrowth. It's like bolting the server racks to the floor so the data never gets corrupted, even if it means a damaged rack stays broken forever.
Exactly. And the tragic consequence of that evolutionary choice becomes terribly apparent in severe trauma. This is the underlying physiological reason why a crushed peripheral nerve in your arm can slowly heal, but a severed spinal cord causes permanent, irreversible loss of function below the injury line.
Yeah, the texts highlighted actor Christopher Reeve, who was permanently paralyzed in a horseback riding accident back in 1995.
Right.
The physical trauma occurred to the spinal cord, which is CNS territory. The local cellular environment there is just fundamentally hostile to regeneration.
That's right. And this microscopic difference in myelin also explains the contrasting outcomes of two major demyelinating diseases, Guillain-Barré syndrome and multiple sclerosis. Both involve the patient's own immune system attacking the myelin insulation, but the long-term prognosis hinges entirely on where the attack happens.
Right, so Guillain-Barré syndrome targets the Schwann cells in the peripheral nervous system. It is frequently triggered by a prior bacterial infection, classically Campylobacter jejuni, which is a common culprit in undercooked chicken, right?
Yep, exactly.
So the immune system gets confused and attacks the peripheral nerves, causing this ascending paralysis that starts in the legs and can move up to the point of requiring a mechanical ventilator. But because the attack happens in the peripheral nervous system, which has that capacity to regenerate, the vast majority of patients eventually recover substantial function.
Exactly. Whereas multiple sclerosis specifically attacks the oligodendrocytes inside the central nervous system. It produces lesions directly on the brain and spinal cord.
And because the CNS actively suppresses regeneration with those no-go proteins.
Right. Those lesions never heal completely, leaving patients with accumulating, lasting neurological deficits. The underlying autoimmune pathology is incredibly similar, but the geographical location of the attack changes the outcome dramatically.
And this structural divide doesn't just dictate how you heal from injuries or autoimmune diseases. It actually determines how biological invaders hack your system. Certain viruses are acutely aware of these anatomical borders, and they exploit them like a straight-up horror movie. Take shingles.
Oh yeah, shingles is a masterclass in exploiting anatomical geography. So after you contract chickenpox as a child, the varicella zoster virus doesn't actually leave your body when you recover.
It just hides.
Yeah, it retreats and hides inside the dorsal root ganglia.
And those are the clusters of sensory neuron cell bodies sitting just outside the spinal cord, squarely in peripheral territory.
Exactly. The virus basically camps out in the exposed cables, just outside the fortified walls of the CNS. It can lie dormant there for decades, hidden from the immune system. Then, during periods of severe stress or immune suppression, it reactivates.
Oh, no.
But it doesn't spread randomly. It travels back down that one specific peripheral sensory nerve, erupting into a painful, blistering rash along a very specific band of skin called a dermatome.
So the rash is like a real-time physical map of exactly which peripheral nerve that specific ganglion supplies.
Exactly. And then you have rabies, which takes biological hacking even further. A rabies infection usually enters through a peripheral animal bite. It infects the exposed nerve endings in the muscle, and then it deliberately travels backward retrograde, sneaking up the peripheral axons until it breaches the central fortress of the brain.
Which is terrifying. And this mechanism is exactly why clinical triage for an animal bite depends so heavily on the physical location of the wound. A rabid bite on the face has a significantly shorter, far more dangerous incubation period than a bite on the foot, simply because the virus has far less peripheral cable to traverse before it successfully infiltrates the central server room.
Yep. And then you have the polio virus, which operates on a slightly different trajectory, but also ruthlessly exploits the anatomical map. Polio specifically targets and destroys motor neurons located in the anterior horn of the spinal cord.
Okay.
Because it destroys central nervous tissue responsible for outgoing motor commands, paralytic polio leaves a person unable to move their limbs without necessarily damaging the incoming peripheral sensory cables that allow them to still feel physical touch.
Unbelievable. To understand how these massive life-altering consequences, paralysis, viral attacks, regeneration actually function, we have to look down at the microscopic cellular level. And figuring out what these structures actually looked like under a microscope spawned one of the most intense, petty rivalries in the history of science.
Oh, you mean the neuron doctrine controversy?
Yes. In the late 19th century, scientists were fiercely debating the actual physical structure of nervous tissue. You had this Italian biologist named Camillo Golgi, and he invented a revolutionary silver staining technique that finally made individual neurons visible under a microscope.
A huge breakthrough.
Huge! But when Golgi looked at his slides, he concluded that the entire nervous system was one continuous, fused, giant web of tissue. This was known as reticular theory.
Right. But shortly after, this Spanish neuroscientist named Santiago Ramon y Cajal utilized Golgi's exact same silver staining method, stared through his own microscope, and argued the exact opposite.
He was like, no, you're wrong.
Totally. Cajal insisted that the nervous system was not a fused web. He realized it was composed of billions of discrete individual cells, all separated by these infinitesimally small gaps.
And Cajal was entirely right. Those tiny gaps are what we now call synapses. His observation became the neuron doctrine, which serves as the foundational bedrock of all modern neurobiology.
And the bitter irony is that Golgi's staining technique was essential to proving Cajal's theory. Their combined contributions were so monumental that the Nobel Committee forced them to share the 1906 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine.
Even though they violently disagreed on the fundamental structure of the brain.
Yeah. And Golgi was so enraged by the shared award that he used his official Nobel lecture in Stockholm to publicly attack Cajal's theory of individual cells, even though Cajal was sitting right there in the audience and the scientific community already knew Cajal was right.
That is amazing. Establishing that neurons are individual, discrete cells actually helps clear up a massive vocabulary misconception that people still have today. People constantly use the words nerve and neuron interchangeably.
Oh, all the time. But a neuron is a single microscopic cell. A nerve is a macroscopic bundle of thousands of peripheral axons, wrapped tightly together in tough connective tissue. A nerve is a thick biological cable. Furthermore, anatomically speaking, the word nerve only ever applies to the peripheral nervous system.
Right. If you have a massive bundle of axons running inside the central nervous system, anatomists refuse to call it a nerve. They call it a tract or a pathway. The rigid vocabulary itself encodes the boundary line.
We also need to correct the misconception regarding the autonomic nervous system.
Oh, right.
This is the hardware that handles your involuntary survival functions, your fight-or-flight adrenaline spikes, your rest and digest processes.
Yeah, I always assumed the autonomic system was a third, totally separate, parallel division of the nervous system.
A lot of people do. But it is actually a subdivision that bridges across both the CNS and the PNS.
Okay.
The command centers regulating your heart rate and breathing, like the hypothalamus and the brainstem, they live safely locked inside the CNS fortress. But the ganglia and the long wiring that actually reach out to manipulate your lungs and digestive organs are undeniably PNS cables.
And before we finish mapping this out, we have to give proper respect to the spinal cord. We tend to view the spinal cord as just this passive extension cord ferrying signals up to the brain, but it performs complex computations entirely on its own.
Oh, definitely. Just consider the classic knee-jerk reflex test at a doctor's office.
Right, the little hammer.
Exactly. The physician taps your patellar tendon with a small hammer. A sensory peripheral neuron detects the sudden stretch in the muscle and rushes that signal directly into your spinal cord.
But rather than sending that alert all the way up to the brain to ask for permission to move, the spinal cord just unilaterally handles the threat.
Right. The incoming sensory neuron synapses directly onto a motor neuron right there inside the spinal cord. That motor neuron instantly fires an efferent command back down the peripheral nerve, forcing your thigh muscle to contract and kick your leg out.
It's so fast.
That entire localized reflex loop takes about 30 to 50 milliseconds. Your brain is completely unaware of the event until after your leg has already kicked. It is a flawless demonstration of the spinal cord acting as a highly efficient, totally independent computing center.
So what does this all mean when we aggregate all this historical anatomy, the viral hacking, the microscopic cellular biology? How does this conceptual split actually manifest in a modern hospital room?
This divide is essentially the absolute backbone of clinical triage. Medical professionals are constantly running diagnostics to determine whether a neurological failure is happening inside the fortress or out on the exposed cables.
For instance, a stroke or a malignant brain tumor constitutes a central nervous system emergency. But a condition like diabetic peripheral neuropathy is strictly a PNS failure.
Right. Roughly half of all patients with long-standing diabetes will develop that neuropathy. Chronically high blood sugar physically degrades the myelin insulation on the exposed peripheral cables.
Wow.
And the damage always manifests in the longest cables first, which is why patients typically experience numbness and tingling starting at the very tips of their toes and fingers, slowly progressing upward in what neurologists call the classic glove and stocking pattern.
The boundary is also heavily utilized by anesthesiologists. When they administer an epidural during childbirth, they are specifically targeting the tiny space just outside the spinal cord. They are bathing the peripheral spinal nerve roots in medication to block the incoming pain signals.
Yeah, they are intentionally intercepting the data on the PNS side of the border. By stopping the signal before it ever crosses into the central nervous system, the patient can be completely numb from the waist down while their brain remains entirely awake, alert, and unaffected by the anesthetic.
Man, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We started by dismantling the idea of a continuous tangled web, revealing how meticulously the body divides its labor. We explored the highly protected central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, floating in shock-absorbing fluid locked behind the tight cellular mortar of the blood-brain barrier.
And we charted the exposed, vulnerable peripheral nervous system carrying all that sensory and motor data, proving Charles Bell and Francois Megendi's directional one-way streets from 2 centuries ago.
We unpack the incredible mechanism of Wallerian degeneration, explaining why a crushed arm can regenerate at 1 millimeter a day thanks to peripheral Schwann cells. And we confronted the devastating reality that the central nervous system utilizes chemical stop signs like no-go proteins to actively block spinal cord regeneration, prioritizing the stability of your consciousness over the ability to physically heal.
And of course, we realized that between your localized spinal reflexes and the 500 million neurons operating the peristalsis in your gut, your peripheral networks are constantly executing complex physiological decisions without ever consulting the brain.
The next time you accidentally slice your finger in the kitchen or you test your reflexes, take a second to genuinely appreciate the invisible 1 millimeter a day cellular repair work your peripheral cables are likely executing right now. And maybe direct a little gratitude toward the heavy, bony fortress that fiercely protects the server room of your consciousness.
You know, this entire deep dive raises an incredibly important question about the future of human longevity.
Oh.
Yeah, we discuss how the central nervous system utilizes inhibitory no-go proteins and glial scarring to actively block regrowth. But researchers are currently spending billions trying to map those chemical stop signs.
Oh.
If neuroscientists eventually crack the code to neutralize those inhibitory proteins, if they figure out how to force brain and spinal cord tissue to regenerate just like a peripheral nerve in your finger, it wouldn't just cure spinal cord injuries.
Right.
If the central server room could suddenly be coaxed into rebuilding its own damaged hardware, could the human brain eventually learn to naturally repair the devastating neural decay caused by strokes or even Alzheimer's disease? Erasing that boundary could fundamentally alter the natural limits of the human lifespan.
That is a staggering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us as we mapped out the brilliant, messy, and deeply functional wiring of the human machine. Until next time, keep exploring the deep dive.